Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove, and this is part 2 of our 3-part series on the role of Spiritism in the Mexican Revolution. With me is C.M. Mayo, who is the author of Metaphysical Odyssey into the Mexican Revolution, Francisco I. Madero and his secret book, Spiritist Manual. She is also author of a novel based on a true story, The Last Prince of the Mexican Empire. In addition, she is the editor of an anthology called Mexico, a traveler's literary companion, and she's written other travel books, including Miraculous Air and Sky over El Nido. Welcome again, C.M.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
It's a pleasure to be with you. Now, we're talking about your recent book, Metaphysical Odyssey into the Mexican Revolution, and you were telling me that it's a metaphysical odyssey in more ways than one.
3 ways.
Mm-hmm.
Madero's Metaphysical Odyssey, his odyssey into becoming the leader of Mexico's 1910 revolution, but also my odyssey in having encountered his book and translated it and trying to give it a context.
Mm-hmm.
It definitely was an odyssey for me,
Mm-hmm.
and also for the reader. The way that the book is constructed, I am a literary writer of fiction and creative nonfiction and a translator. So the way I've constructed my narrative is perhaps very different than what you would encounter in most of the nonfiction literature on the revolution.
Yeah.
So I hope my sources are all very clear and my bibliography is as good as I could make it. But it is written in a literary style, and it is precisely meant to bring in a reader who might not know anything about the Mexican Revolution and Francisco Madero, and or may not know anything about esoteric literature. And I think that for those who are not familiar with esoteric literature, and I realize most of the people watching your show are very familiar, but most people are not.
Mm-hmm.
And so they encounter Madero's Spiritism as something very disturbing that even provokes hostility for them.
Yeah.
And so his book, The Spiritist Manual, is a difficult book for many people to read. And as we were talking earlier, your book on PK Man, I felt a kinship with that book because I can imagine how difficult it was to write it and publish it because for many people that material is very difficult to read.
Yes, that book took me several decades, actually, before I could find it within me and before it could find a publisher. I had publishers who said, this is not a very good work of fiction. They simply refused to believe it was nonfiction.
I've had people say to me, Catherine, I loved your book, but I will not read the Spiritist Manual. And I thought, well, interesting that people felt the need to tell me that.
Some people think it's the work of the devil.
Well, there's that. Yes, that's true. And as a matter of fact, when I presented the book, I've had people say, sorry, my friends couldn't come, but their priest wouldn't let them. And I always say, well, I'm not promoting Spiritism. This is a work of history. This is a nonfiction work of history about it. I'm not trying to convince anybody of any religious ideas, but that's true. But I think among a lot of educated people, the hostility comes from just a knee-jerk reaction of dismissal, that they won't even consider it.
Yeah. This is beneath their consideration.
Exactly, exactly.
And I think it's fair to say, to the best of my knowledge, you are not a spiritist.
No, I'm not. No, I'm not. But I like to try to see the truth, and sometimes that requires a bit of an odyssey. It requires a bit of a journey that can sometimes be very difficult to come into material and say, well, he's talking about this or he's talking about that. I need to understand, where did he get these ideas and what does he mean by this? And just tackle it,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and be willing to sit with some things that don't always that don't always make one comfortable. I mean, in political science literature, people often talk about cognitive dissonance. And an example with Maduro would be if you believe hearing disembodied voices is schizophrenia, and you believe Maduro was a hero, how can you put those two together? Well, you can't. And therefore, you feel very uncomfortable. And therefore, you either ignore that or you decide he's a nutter. And there's nothing more to say. And I want to move past that. And I love what Jeff Kripal calls the cut. You make the cut. You say there's a phenomena that doesn't necessarily mean that we understand what it is or that we perceive it.
Right.
We're gonna remove judgment and allow ourselves to simply sit in ambiguity and consider it. That doesn't mean we have to say no or yes. We're just in that gray zone. That suddenly gives us a lot of power to consider things and find context for things that otherwise would have just been beyond our ken. And that is what I have tried to do with those. And I think what you did with PK Man. And so I'm especially honored to be talking with you about this.
I gather you read the PK Man before you began this odyssey.
I did, but I didn't read it as part of my research. I had always been interested in reading on things of this nature, but I had not read them in a systematic way. It was more just intuitive. Well, I find that interesting, or I find this interesting, and I'll just read it, you know. I liked things that opened a sense of possibilities of just sort of intellectual courageousness. I've always been interested in that. But when I encountered the Spiritist Manual, I didn't have a context. So I had to actually go back and do a lot of reading that I had never had any interest in doing, like, you know, academic studies of the history of metaphysical religion. And I actually benefited a great deal because over the last decade, a number of researchers, I'm thinking of Catherine Albanese, who's a professor of religion at University of California, Santa Barbara, Jeff Kripal, who's at Rice University, John Warren Monroe, Sophie LaChapelle. There are a lot of people who've written as academic historians of whether of France or of metaphysical religion or what is it, but whatever it may be. But these are serious historians in academia publishing with university presses. In the last 10, 15 years, a number of books have come out that enabled me to get from that a sense of context. That without that, I really would have been at sea.
I have read some of those books, and I think the authors are quite skillful at as you say, sitting in ambiguity, not feeling the necessity to achieve closure about, you know, was this a real spirit or not?
When we look at that literature and go back a few decades, one of the great figures is Frances Yates, writing about the Renaissance, esoteric traditions in the Renaissance. And I was always struck by one of the things she said in her book on Rosicrucianism, which is that modern Rosicrucianism is beneath the dignity of the serious historian's consideration. I'm probably not quoting that precisely correctly, but it was just, it's below the dignity to consider. And I always thought, well,
because she is looking at it in the 17th century, which is so much more worthy of a historian's consideration.
And I think that attitude, which, you know, in her work is wonderful and important, but I think that her slamming that door shut, that is a door that other academic historians in the last 10, 15 years have been opening.
Sure.
And so as a creative writer and translator coming into my project on translating the Spiritist Manual and giving it a context, so my book is about his book and it includes my translation of his book, I benefited enormously from this more recent literature.
Well, let's talk a little bit about his odyssey. He's born into one of the wealthiest families. He has a background in business, a background in agriculture. He's every reason to think that he is well grounded in the material world and has many benefits accruing to him. He's, you know, expected to become a patriarch of a major family, and yet something pulled him into the Spiritist universe to the point where he himself became a medium. I'm sure that was a gradual process.
I would think so. It seems so, yeah. Yeah, his background, when we think of the Mexican Revolution, I think most people have in their mind figures like Zapata, who had the big wash tub
sombrero,
the
yes.
bandoliers and the huaraches, and we think of the soldaderas, the women on the trains, and we think of Pancho Villa. But in fact, the revolution was launched in 1910 by Francisco Madero, who was the grandson of one of Mexico's wealthiest men. He was beautifully educated for his time and place.
And of short stature, as I recall.
He was short stature. He was bald, so the cartoonists had a field day. He was easy to draw and recognize, and so but he was usually very well dressed in a top hat and bespoke suits, and
which gave him the means to pursue the revolution in ways that other people could not.
Yeah, and I think that's a very important point. Because he was overthrown and because he was a Spiritist, it's very easy for many people to jump to the conclusion that, he was an idealist, he wasn't serious, he was weak or whatever. But I think if we again come back to context and we look at the context, it starts looking very different. This was a person with immense communication skills, administrative skills, diplomatic skills, interpersonal skills, and I think he understood perfectly well that if the government were overthrown, it would be difficult to govern without the support of the army. So he had to do a lot of things in order to say to the army, okay, we're fighting you, but we'll maintain your hierarchy. So, I mean, we could talk for 2 hours just about that.
He was a revolutionary, but not in the sense of wanting to completely change every aspect of the system.
I think he was more pragmatic than we often give him credit for. And I think he was more sophisticated than we often give him credit for. I think a really key point is that when you have a revolution, you only have it because the executive was weak to begin with, or it wouldn't have fallen. And the process of the revolution makes it weaker. Yeah. So once a new executive comes in, they've got some real challenges no matter who they are. So no matter who Maduro had been, taking the presidency in 1911 was an enormous challenge. Yeah. And the counter-revolution, I think, would have come no matter what. But I do think, and I think we're going to go there in one of your questions about the question of the role of Spiritism in his downfall.
We will get to that in part 3.
Okay.
But in part 2, what I'm really interested in exploring is why would the Spiritist philosophy that he held lead him to even conceive of launching a revolution?
Well, I think he saw a great deal of injustice. I think that during the period of Porfirio Diaz's rule, they had opened up a lot of investment to foreigners and taken a lot of land. And there have been huge accumulations of land.
We're talking about a dictator who had held power for 30 years.
I think that there were a lot of people, students, workers, both agricultural and industrial workers who were sometimes the same back and forth. An emerging middle class really felt, no, there's too much crony capitalism going on.
The country is really still, I suppose, in transition from the earlier monarchy.
That's another important point. Yeah, I think, and that was the subject of my novel. Mexico had 2 monarchies, actually. And so I don't know how much detail you want to go into in this, but I think the main take-home point here is really 19th century Mexico is an endless, it's very complicated. Anybody who can name every single executive in correct order gets a gold star. It's a very complicated period, but the main thing is they got their independence from Spain, but it was an open question. It was a contested question whether the form of government would be a republic or whether it would be a monarchy. And there was, in fact, a monarchy that was quickly overthrown, and that was the Emperor Agustin Iturbide. And then there were various different governments and civil wars, and then the French took the opportunity to invade. And that was when in the United States, we had our Civil War going on, so it was kind of easier for them to feel they could do that without being confronted.
Without stepping on our toes, we were busy.
Exactly. So then that happened, and there was some support. Obviously, not enough to make it work, but there was some support for another monarchy, and that was a Habsburg. That was Maximilian von Habsburg, and that question of succession was the subject of my novel that came out right before I started translating the Spiritist Manual.
Yes.
So I had this question of transition on my mind, and I could really appreciate how Madera's call for revolution wasn't just a call for social justice or economic justice. It was a call for no re-election. In other words, when the president comes in, he cannot run again. That was what his call established.
But he was also, if I understand properly, he was concerned about the suffering of the average Mexican.
Very much so. And I think that was very much connected with his sense of what it meant to be a Spiritist as well. But I think coming to the question of how could he be a Spiritist and how could he, send people into battle?
Yeah.
I think that has two answers. And one is that I think my understanding is that he saw himself as a healer. And in fact, he
People
studied
came to him for healing.
homeopathy. He was a student of homeopathy, which was a German system of microdoses.
Yes.
Very interesting area.
Still practiced today.
And he had his little bag, and he had his little pills. In Spanish, the chuches or chunches or something like that. They have a funny word. The tiny little pills, and he would go around dispensing that. But I think that he saw the body politic as something that needed healing, and that he was a healer. But related to that is what we talked about in the last session, was that he was very much a close student of the Bhagavad Gita, of this Hindu holy text where Lord Krishna is telling the warrior, you must do your duty.
And not only that, explaining to him that every person has an immortal soul.
Exactly. So you must not care about the material world. You must do the right thing. So he did.
And for him, the right thing was also, I'm pretty sure that he envisioned this revolution as somehow furthering the spiritual liberation of the people of Mexico, that they would understand that, I think if I recall his words, that they would understand that they don't need to become ensnared in the traps of materialism.
And the Catholic Church. He was a leading evangelist for Spiritism, and he was not only writing for magazines and sponsoring magazines about Spiritism, but he was an active organizer of 2 congresses, which met in Mexico City, which were quite high profile for the time. So although he tried to keep his Spiritism under wraps, as it were, it was an open knowledge.
People who knew him knew about his activities. He was funding these organizations.
And attending and writing about them. And so it was known that he was trying to evangelize for Spiritism. He believed that Spiritism is a science and a philosophy and a religion, and that it should be what everybody believes. That's what he believed.
He believed that the truths of Spiritism, as he called it, were so profound and so noble that people would instantly recognize their truth.
Well, he felt that way, and that was the case for him. But an important thing to underline is that the Catholic Church did not agree with that. And when he would say things as he does in his Spiritist Manual, that you don't need the clergy, you don't need the ritual of the Mass, this was highly threatening to the Church and to the people who believed in the Church or were allied with the Church. I think that he did have the plan to try to supplant the Catholic Church, which was deeply threatening to many people.
Well, ultimately, in effect, the Mexican Revolution did a certain amount of supplanting of the Catholic Church.
Well, there have been battles against the Catholic Church going back for a very long time.
Yeah.
Benito Juarez being the most famous example of one who battled the Catholic Church with the laws of reform, but that was definitely a factor.
And he felt inspired by Juarez's example, whether or not it was in spirit form.
Yeah, he in his book La Sucesión Presidencial en 1910, with the presidential succession of 1910, which was his political platform, he gives the history of Mexico, where of course Benito Juarez appears as a great hero of the Republic.
Juarez is the one who eventually ended the monarchy.
That's right. His forces eventually got the French to leave, and Maximilian arrested and executed after a trial and reestablished the Republic. But unfortunately, really long story short, after Benito Juarez's death, along came Porfirio Diaz, who just kept getting elected.
He became a dictator.
Essentially, yeah, with the sort of the form of a republic, but the reality of something very different.
Practically a monarch.
Exactly.
And managed to hold on to power until he was 80.
Right. And so when Madero called for free and open elections and no re-election, Porfirio Diaz put Madero in jail. And Madero, that was where Madero finished the Spiritus Manual.
In jail.
And then he escaped, disguised as a railroad worker, to Texas, and then launched the revolution.
At that point. And at the same time, feeling all the way that he was being guided by spiritual forces.
That certainly seems to be the case.
I mean, you have his private notebooks, or you have seen them. I don't mean you have them.
Well, you know what? They're not as private as you might think. They are in the National Palace. The Francisco Madero Archive is in Mexico's National Palace. And you can Google that up and look at the website and see the catalog. But the mediumistic notebooks actually were transcribed and published as part of the 10-volume series called The Writings, this is my translation, The Writings of Francisco Madero. And that is in Spanish, and the editor is Alejandro Rosas. So it's difficult to find a copy for sale, but if you go to worldcat.org, that'll show you which libraries have it. And you might be surprised how many do. So it's not that secret or private. Viewers can scare that
They
up.
are accessible, and these are the transcriptions of the many seance sessions that he held.
Channeled writings.
Channeled writings.
He would go into a trance and channel, and that's what was transcribed.
And the process by which he trained himself to become a channel, do we know much about that?
My understanding is that it was meditation and just quieting the mind, and that he did it with his group, a group of people, a
select circle.
A circle, which was a typical structure at that time. People would often form circles to train together. I think that's still true today.
It is.
Yeah.
So he developed his automatic writing, and in the process, he felt he was in communication with his deceased brother, Raul.
And later, other spirits who came to advise him on writing La Sucesión Presidencial en 1910.
Yeah. In other words, his great political manifesto was being guided by these spirit voices, including one who signed himself BJ, which could be taken for Benito Juarez.
It could be. I won't go that far, but most people do. Yeah.
And you couldn't rule it out.
Well, it seems logical.
You don't have any reason to rule it out, do you?
No, not really. It seems logical.
Yeah.
But I mean, the fact is, it says BJ. It doesn't say Benito Juarez.
No, but there's good reason to think, and no reason not to think, that he felt that he was getting direct inspiration from a previous hero of Mexican history, somebody who was president 30, 40 years before him.
That seems to be precisely what he believed, and I argue that that's what he believed. Whether that is actually the case, I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Still, from whoever he believed it was, he was getting guidance about, prepare yourself to launch a revolution.
Mm-hmm.
Challenge the dictator. Dedicate all of your resources to this cause. Nothing can be more important. Be willing to sacrifice absolutely everything.
And his grandfather, who was the head of the family, who was this very wealthy agro-industrialist who had every kind of business you can think of, and in fact did regular business trips to Mexico City to meet with the Secretary of Treasury, he was adamantly refused to this. And he wrote a letter to his grandson where he said, this is my translation, you're putting boogers in the chocolate. Estás echando mocos al atole. So I took a bit of a liberty with that translation. Atole actually isn't necessarily chocolate, but I think that's what English readers would understand. Where he was basically saying, you don't know what you're doing. You're crazy.
You're making a mess of things.
This is terrible.
Yeah.
And so Madero had to put up with, he did have the support of some members of his family, and in particular his younger brother Gustavo was very helpful to him. And later his father came on board and other members of the family came on board. But to have the head of the family, Don Evaristo, be against this was a tremendous thing.
And at the end of the day, the family suffered a great deal because of their support. Well, once again, we're running out of time. But the exciting part of the story will be in our third episode. Thank you so much for being with me.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you.
And thank you for being with us. Be sure to check your listings for part 3 of our 3-part series on the role of Spiritism in the Mexican Revolution.